All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I will probably be unsuccessful, but if you want to move up, that'd be great. I mean, I feel like my professors in school and in college would always say, come to the front of the class, and very few people did. But if you want to, we can make it a little more intimate. I think we feel a little far away up here. But anyway, my name's Pablo Garza. I'm basically a policy analyst in the California State Legislature, and I'm going to attempt to moderate this unruly bunch up here as we discuss a sustainable framework for flood flow recharge. I think before I'll introduce the panelists briefly in a second, and to just kind of frame this up, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed just over 10 years ago, and I've noticed, I've been in the space, a real interest in groundwater recharge and as a way to, a supply side way to solve our groundwater deficit. So this policy issue of what is groundwater recharge, when do we have enough water in the system to divert and solve our groundwater supply problems has been playing out for the last decade that I've seen. I'm sure it goes back even further than that. What we're going to talk about today is flood flows, or flood MAR is a really wonky way, but that MAR is managed aquifer recharge, and it's sort of this idea of deriving flood protection benefits as well as groundwater recharge benefits. And so that's going to be the focus here. And I think particularly with climate change and what we're seeing, these extremes, the last decade, what we've seen in California is just unprecedented. Two of our worst droughts on record with two of our wettest years on record. And so we're going from, the kind of the wetter wets, hotter hots, going through that extreme. And so the promise of diverting flood flows to derive both flood protection benefits and water supply benefits is really promising. And I think the question is, how do we get there? What's the policy framework we need, to get there? And we have a couple of recent policy developments we can go into, and to discuss this is this panel here. And so I'll start with, to my right is Dave Owen. He's a professor of law at University of California, San Francisco Law. There's Natalie Escobedo Garcia. She's a policy coordinator of water programs at the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. She's you're on a big screen, like the Wizard of Oz for us, so it's nice to see you. Then we have Aaron Fukuda. He's the general manager of Tulare Irrigation District, and he's actually doing this on the ground. Next to him is Ashley Overhouse, water policy advisor with the Defenders of Wildlife. And on the end, we have Monty Schmidt, and last but not least, senior project director with the Nature Conservancy. So I guess to kick it off with the first question I had for the panel, I was going to tap Dave for this, is just kind of to set a baseline, when we're talking about groundwater recharge, what types of rights, permits are involved, what are needed? Can a landowner or water right holder simply divert water from a stream onto their land in an attempt to recharge groundwater? And if you want to embellish on that, please feel free.
Yeah, so I'm going to give the lawyer's answer, which is what you can do legally, not what you can do if nobody notices. But the quick answer is, for most recharge projects, you do need a water right, but not all. And that right would generally need to be an appropriative right, because riparian rights can't be used for long-term storage. And the key question is whether your project involves a diversion of water. And so if your project involves essentially sticking a pipe into a surface waterway and pulling water out of that surface waterway and then putting it on a spreading center or through an injection well, that's very clearly a diversion. You need an appropriative right to do that, with a limited exception that I'll get to in a moment. There are other ways to do groundwater recharge projects. So, for example, at the other end of the spectrum, a broader landscape scale approach might be forest management, where you're trying to do selective thinning and controlled burns of forests to reduce, among other reasons, to reduce the amount of water taken up by the forest. That is going to lead to heightened levels of groundwater recharge and surface water flow, but that doesn't require a right, or a surface water right, in order to engage in that kind of process. And then there are sort of gray areas in between. If you put a single notch in a levee and allow that water to flow onto a field, I would argue, I think that that is a diversion. If you set back the levees on an existing floodplain, say on the Cosumnes River, since that's where the Nature Conservancy works, and then essentially allow that river to reclaim its floodplain, that's going to do recharge. But that probably, I think, is not a diversion. So you can get some gray areas as well. The one situation under California law where you have been able to divert water without needing a water right is basically where you have extreme flood flows and an agency that is diverting those flows not for the purpose specific or is essentially diverting those flows for purposes of flood control. So in that circumstance, we've allowed limited diversion of water without a right for purposes of recharge. You also, in an urban setting, can divert without a water right, or not divert without a water right, but recharge without a water right if you're working with treated wastewater or captured stormwater. So again, simple question, it's very complicated. The last thing I'll say is, even if you didn't need a water right to divert that water in the first place, you may need a groundwater right to extract it if the water that you are extracting, if it was originally diverted surface water and you had a surface water right, it stays as legal surface water, and then you don't need a groundwater right to extract it. But if it wasn't classified as legal surface water and was recharged, then you would need a groundwater right to get it out. So again, quick demonstration of the ability of a lawyer to take something that sounds very simple and make it very complicated.
I think you did a good job, actually. Question, maybe backing up, follow up with, what's the difference between groundwater rights and surface water rights? Can you answer that in 2 sentences?
Yeah, they're both property rights, but in California we've had different systems of water rights for groundwater and surface water. So our groundwater rights are either what we call correlative rights, and those are rights held by overlying landowners to pump water from beneath their land and use it on that land. Or you could have an appropriative right to groundwater, which is in the hierarchy of groundwater rights is lower than an overlying right, and that's a right to pump groundwater and then use it on some other parcel. And then for surface water rights, we have appropriative rights as well, and these are rights that are allocated on the basis of temporal priority. So the first person to establish a right has priority over people who came after. And then we also have riparian rights. I don't know the exact numbers, but most of the water rights that we deal with in California are appropriative rights.
Oh, thank you. I'm impressed. I would have talked a lot longer on that question. and probably got it wrong. Anyway, well, second, like being around the debate on groundwater recharge and flood mar has been, from my view, a lot of the conflict is over whose water, like when do we have a flood flow or when do we have excess water and whose water is that, right? We have fully appropriated streams in the state and where there really isn't excess water. And you see entities like public agencies will apply for a temporary permit and they're protested by junior water right holders. So there's this fight over what is truly excess. And then, I don't want to steal Ashley's thunder, but like what's the environment's need? But we don't have well-established environmental needs, as you said. So like, how do you think about that from a legal perspective? And others can weigh in on this. Like, what are we talking about when we say flood flows or excess water? Or
you want me to start?
Yeah, if you.
Okay, so people often, with groundwater recharge, will talk about the basic concept is let's take flood flows and put them in the ground, and then we deal with flooding, which can be a bad thing, and we store the groundwater, which can be a very good thing. So it's in concept, it's a kill two birds with one stone approach. It gets complicated when we try to define what counts as a flood flow or what counts as just available water. And at one end of the spectrum of possibilities, you could say, well, that's just any water that isn't already legally allocated either to some other user or to environmental flows. At the other end of the spectrum, you could say, well, let's only treat as flood flows floods that are of such a scale that they're just dangerous and they don't have any ecological value. And then the hard questions are in between. And the questions are hard, first because a lot of flood flows do have ecological value. Like more and more we're learning that salmon and other things that live in our waterways are happiest when they get to grow up in floodplains. And that a lot of our aquatic ecosystems really depend on flooding to be healthy. And so not all floods are bad. Some floods are very good for the environment, and that can be good for groundwater recharge too, if we're flooding areas where the recharge will occur, or it can be a conflict, because sometimes the best place to flood for recharge is a place where that water will go straight into the ground and won't linger on the surface. And then the other challenge is that we have done a very, very uneven job of taking the general concepts in our water law, like the idea that there should be public trust flows, or that reasonable use should limit water use, or that there should be endangered species protection, and translating those into specific standards for in-stream flow. So there are a lot of situations where water might be legally unallocated, or at least there's no quantified allocation of flows to the environment, yet there's a sense on the part of environmental advocates that legally some of those flows should go to the environment. And then that creates a question, well, are those flows available for recharge or are they not? So again, a simple term like flood flows conceals all these layers of complexity and sometimes some pretty difficult policy choices about what our priority is with the water that is above normal levels, but still within the range of what the environment might sort of need.
Paul, I'll just add to that too, because I deal with it on a regular basis, because as the irrigation district, we manage flood flows. Okay, that's as far as it goes. And so the question becomes, well, you have flood flows in the Kauai system. The problem is you have to bifurcate flood flows into two categories in my mind. There's fully appropriated streams and then not fully appropriated streams. And in the fully appropriated streams, like in ours, there's a flood management diagram, and we operate through that diagram, and so everybody has a specific priorities in that flood operation, and so we coordinate that flood operation. In other streams that are not fully appropriated, that's where the definition becomes hard, because you have to define where's that demarcation line of when somebody can take the water or not, and there's people downstream, including the environment, that could be harmed by inadvertent good actions above, right? So it's a trade-off at that point. But in like 2023, there is just too much. I mean, that's, to me, everywhere around the state of California, there's very few that wouldn't have qualified in the flood diversion. And then underlying all that is you get to divert it. You can recharge with it, but what is the end use of that water? And back to the water rights, what do you need? The right is defined by the beneficial use. So unfortunately, the state has said in those flood flow situations, you can take it and you can put it in the ground, but there's no way to credit yourself for that right now. I think folks are trying to do that. I'm kind of in a mixed bag on that, because you're diverting it under an emergency right or something, and then all of a sudden you're going to get credit for it to pump. We don't know the outcome of that yet. If you're in a fully appropriate stream, we know how that acts in a conjunctive use basin. We know the puts and the takes, and we can manage that. So, but that's a little nuance on the flood flow and water rights question.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I'll read into this complicated topic, not as an attorney or a water district manager, but I mean, I think that part of the problem is the terminology of flood flow. I mean, if it's truly a flood action, there's an impending flood such that, and what is a flood? A flood is defined many different ways. I don't think that, from an environmental or ecological standpoint, there is such a thing as a flood. There's just higher flows. A flood is kind of more of a concept tied to damages. It's something dangerous, something that needs to be avoided, managed, prevented. And I think that when we're talking about a flood flow where there's at risk of the flood control system as it's designed to varying degrees and standards and so forth in California, is at risk of causing harm, damage, loss of life, risk to property and so forth. To me, if there was to clean up some of the thinking around this, would be to define that as a flood flow, is where there's imminent danger, in which case we have a system within California where there are agencies who manage floods, and there's flood operation rules for good reasons, because when an actual flood event is in danger of happening, there's a really need to be well coordinated to ensure maximizing public safety and so forth. So there's flood flows and then there's high flows, which, I think is a really different, can be a very different thing, where now it's not a matter of flood safety. Now it's available because there's now a sense that there's unallocated water there that could be taken, appropriated, used in some way. And I think that for this issue, when we want to talk about how do we increase recharge, I think we have to solve for those two equations separately, but relatedly, in the sense that when we talk about flood flows, we should get really good about deciding what is a flood flow and making sure that we're not impeding all the flood safety aspects of managing a flood flow, because that's a really different thing than there's high flows in the river. We're not sure that people have an allocation to that. What could people use? What does the environment need? What are the downstream water rights? And other things become more complicated. So I think in that way, the terminology needs to be separated. And then when you're talking about floodmar, are you talking about recharge with floodwater? Or there's all sorts of other terms, on-farm recharge. I've heard, ecomar, where you're trying to do, flooding of floodplains to drive environmental benefits. I think in that way, getting clear about those differences would help come up with a means to make those things happen more quickly and efficiently, because floods or high flows are unpredictable. If they were predictable, we would be like, next Thursday, we're gonna, kind of thing. It's not like that, and it could be years between events. And so being prepared well in advance will help us to actually do as much beneficial recharge in the right way as possible. But it's kind of like all flood management for all the people who work on floods. Where is everybody now? They're over in the other room where there's fires. But if there was a flood, if there had been a flood this year, we would have everybody over in this room, and you'd be standing room only, because flood management is one of those issues that there's interest in it when there's been a flood event. And then, as Jeff Mount once said to me, maybe he was copying somebody else, there's a half-life of the flood event. It's like within the first year after a flood event, there's like urgency to do something, and then a year later, it's like half the people are paying attention to it, and then 2 years later, it's half of those people, and we just haven't had a big flood event in a while.
Natalie,
Just-
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, not to complicate this any further, but like definitely in our work, we sit on the side of the imminent danger piece. We found ourselves in this situation with we work closely with the community of Planada, who unfortunately was flooded during our flood events in 2023. Then we entered into having the emergency order that Governor Newsom had put in place be codified under SB 122, and we came back to that question: how do we define a flood flow? I think for our work, it was important that that be connected to imminent danger, precisely because of what we saw happen in Planada and Pájaro. Yes, we can't predict, how the level of a flood that will happen, but we do know where there are areas that are higher risk. We know where there are areas that could benefit from recharge. Those are things that I would argue we knew going into 2023, but to the point that was just made, often California, for everything that we do right, when it comes to water, we tend to be very reactive instead of proactive. We wait to have these discussions until after we've found ourselves in a difficult situation. I think for some folks, we're able to do really great things with those flood flows. I know Aaron and the Kauias, they were able to do some great recharge during those times, but then we also had the situations like Pájaro and Planada. And then on the point of just recharge alone, I think we do also have to become a lot better at understanding whether we are doing recharge or what you're doing is banking, because those are two very different things. And I think nestled in the conversation around recharge is that for many of our basins, we are in active recovery. There's still many of our basins are still over pumped. They're currently recovering from that. GSAs are trying to get us to a place where those basins are sustainable. So if we're talking about recharge, are you doing it with the purpose of leaving that water behind, or are you going to use it again later in the summer? At which point is that recharge or is that banking? And that kind of adds another layer to that flood flow conversation, is that excess water, or should you be preparing to actually maybe apply for the state water board has like a streamlined process for advanced permitting under the emergency instead of depending on emergency flood policies.
Want to weigh in, Ashley?
So many of my wonderful panelists. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'll project.
You can share.
Thanks, Monty. Have already eloquently said pretty much, what Defenders is most concerned about here with flood flows and defining it to ensure that you are not equating it with excess water. In my opinion, those are two very different things. How you define excess is a misnomer in and of itself for the environment, as Monty alluded to. They're just flows for ecological needs and for wildlife. And excess implies that there is unappropriated water in an over-appropriated system. It also ignores the fact that we were one of the last jurisdictions in the world to regulate groundwater. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was not passed until 2014, really 2015, when we were in the height of what's considered some pretty severe drought years, which garnered the political will. Whether it's been effective at all so far remains in question, but I think that those two fundamental things about our water system, both the fact that we have now over 100 years of groundwater depletion to supposedly make up for, and how we do that and where, in addition to the fundamental overallocation of water resources and severe decline in most of our aquatic species and ecosystems throughout the state because of a fundamental lack of freshwater flow. So when I say I really would prefer we not conflate excess water with how we define flood flows, both in policy and law, I strongly urge us not to.
Point taken. Thank you. Kind of well, going to the ground area. I was thinking, Aaron, if you manage an agency. You're doing this on the ground. Can you talked about it a little bit. Can you talk a little more about what your agency's program looks like and how you deal with some of these questions? Like, is it when do you know it's a flood? Who gets credit for it? I think you said on our prep call you didn't need to use the SB 122 authority because you already had a program in place. So I think just kind of what's this look like in practice?
I'll start out with, I spent an entire day, and I think some of you might have heard this already, I spent an entire day with NPR 2 or 3 years ago out at our irrigation district, and wanted to see what recharge was all about. This was coming right out of COVID, so it was an odd interview with NPR. We had masks on and telescope microphones all over the place to stay 6 feet away. He spent an entire day with me looking at recharge basins, what we do, how we do it, what are percolation rates, what is the science behind what we're doing, and it was hilarious. So out of that entire day, he took one sentence out of my conversation. And I learned how to deal with media at that because he caught me off guard. I was just wandering around a basin. I said, I'm this nerdy engineer that thinks recharge is sexy. And that's what he put in the article. Aaron says recharge is sexy. And so how do we do it? And so in Tulare Irrigation District, we're a 65,000 acre irrigation district. We're a conjunctive use irrigation district, meaning we actively use groundwater recharge as a portfolio for our water supply needs. So we bring excess water in the wet years, put it in the ground, and then use it in the dry years when we need it. I'll be very honest, Natalie, it's our banking operation, but we have it's like one big central bank and everybody has a well that pulls out of it, right? We have pre-1914 water rights on the Kauai River, and we have a contract with the Central Valley Project through the Bureau of Reclamation from the Friant Division that we divert. When the flood flows happened in 2023, immediately after they fired up and the executive order came out, DWR contacted me and they were going around the state. We're cataloging how much recharge is happening under the executive order. How are you using the executive order? I said, what executive order? They go, oh, we passed an executive order. We're in flood flow. We're trying to put water out as fast as we can without flooding homes and communities. I didn't even know there was an executive order. and I have pre-1914 water rights. We've been doing this for 70 plus years. So, and the DDBR rep goes, oh, we didn't realize that. There's a whole section of the state that didn't even need the executive order because it's within their water rights. They've been doing it. We're not the only conjunctive use irrigation district. Fresno ID, Alta ID, Consolidated ID, most of us are. How do we do it? We fire up our canal system, which is the best recharge agent we've got. We've got 300 miles of earthen canals. We did not adopt the big push to line canals. There's a famous project we did. We tried to line one and got sued. And we learned through that experience that our best recharge agent is our canals. So we have 300 miles of unearthed canals that percolates water when we bring it down out of the Sierras. We have 1,300 acres of recharge basins, which are just big ponds on the side of the road that we put water in, where we selectively find ground that has that permeability, the sands, without clays underneath them, and we can percolate water quickly. And then our last component, which we just kind of got going on, which is what they call on-farm recharge or AGMAR, or, I mean, there's so many different names for it. I call it irrigation, flood irrigation. And I've gotten in trouble with some folks because my stance on it is we pushed so hard on the efficiency, drip systems, all those things, and we berated people for flood irrigating. We can't call it flood irrigating anymore because we'd be accused of. So what we call it now is something else, AGMAR or whatever. But really what it is our growers in 2023 put the water out in their fields, and you would just think they're irrigating a crop, but there's no crop there in certain circumstances. Like folks that were going to plant their fields in cotton just furrowed up their fields and just ran the water down the furrows. You'd see almond trees that were dormant. It looks like they're flood irrigating. Pistachios, walnuts are a little tricky. But we got to that system not by just telling people or Sigma. The only way we got to that system was an allocation and a groundwater cutback. So growers in our district, in our GSA, are allocated a pumping allocation and a cap. So they can't pump more than a cap. So now that looks like a restriction on them, right? Little did we know, we wasn't planned this way, when we get to a wet year, it became an incentive tool because they can build credits and use them later on. Typically in January, when we would want to run a flood release or irrigation run, we maybe get a half a dozen to a dozen growers that would take water. If you remember, farmers, when they're in their peak season, basically starts in April, in our April, May, June, July, August, September, and October. It's 24/7. It's not, 6 days, and on the 7th day you go, you get to go do something, or it's not even Friday, we shut down and we come back on Monday. So between October, November, December, January, it's kind of their downtime. It's when they're, working on the tractors, getting things ready to go. They don't want to put water out in the fields. It's their downtime. It's the prep time. What we also found was when you put water out on a field in the middle of a storm, it's a nightmare. So one instance we sent a ditch tender out. He went out to the turnout to open the turnout to the field. He got stuck. We sent the superintendent out with his four-wheel drive to get the two-wheel drive out. The four-wheel drive got stuck. We sent the backhoe to get the other two trucks out. The backhoe got stuck. So then we ended up sending the excavator and the low bed truck. That took all day. So we learned that during winter, that's why growers didn't want to do it. It's difficult. It makes a mess. Creatively, our guys learned, okay, our farmers and our ditch tenders, you park at the edge of the road and you walk in sometimes half a mile. I don't think as far as a mile, but you're going to do a mile run because you're going to walk in a half mile, walk back out. Or you got to bring out a little UTV unit or something like that where you can actually get out in the mud and not make a mess. We also learned you prep your field in the fall. So everything's set and ready to go. So if we do end up with flood flows, they can make those real quick changes out there and they're ready to go. So that's our main how you do recharge in our region. Canals, basins, on-farm recharge. That's probably going to cover 85% of the action in the Central Valley. And I think what we're doing now is we're developing new strategies for recharge, which include vadozone injection wells, which are shallow injection wells, deep injection wells, which look to put it down below Corcoran clays to help in subsidence and other issues, and then the riparian setback or stream overflow around the river channels, right? Use that natural system to increase your recharge. And we're doing all of this in our district. We love to work with other folks. We're partnering with Stanford University, UC Davis. Anybody who knows me or gets to know me knows, you bring me an idea and I don't even need a contract. We're just going to go do it. So we've even employed science. We use SkyTem data, the little helicopter with the loop that flies around. We were one of the first to implement that here in the state of California. We love that so much. We bought a totem unit now. So we take a sled around and we sled the fields in the ground and we identify where those sand streaks are. And that way we can preserve that ground and tell our growers, don't put a barn on that. That's where you're going to do your recharge. And we can mark those areas out for them. So that's kind of how we do that.
Well, back on the flood side of this, I was thinking that Monty and Natalie, you've already talked about this a little bit, but as you said, we had a couple communities, Planada and Pajaro, that flooded in 2023 when kind of got those unexpected rains. Is this a good, I guess, is this idea of floodmar or recharging or diverting flood flows, you think it's a good, effective flood management strategy, or are we doing it well? Do you think are there places we could do more of that, or do we need something else to manage flood protection in those areas? And I'm looking at Monty and Natalie, but if others want to weigh in on this, feel free.
Natalie, do you want to go?
Sure, I can start. Before I get to your question, I did want to elevate one of the points that Aaron made. So I think at least when I think about recharge, one of the things that's really important to me is whether in the area that recharge is happening, there's actual plans for demand reduction. Aaron mentioned that they have a cap in place. That cap isn't just there because they wanted to put a cap there. That cap was put there to make sure that they can move towards having a sustainable system. I think with recharge more and more, we really do have to think about where we're putting recharge, are there actually active plans to reduce demand on that system in order to be able to actually maximize that recharge. On the point of like floodmar, it could have probably been helpful for Planada had we maybe had something in place for them before they were flooded. It certainly would have been helpful. And yeah, floodmar could, in the cases of some communities, not only help them maintain water around their community water system, in some cases it could help regain water. We've had thousands of domestic wells go dry over the last decade. I think my only caution, or well, my larger caution would be that we don't accidentally exacerbate existing problems by doing floodmar. As most folks know, we have a pretty extensive nitrates issue in the San Joaquin Valley. Putting water into a system that is already pretty polluted with nitrates runs the risk of a nitrate spike, which could then put a community system at risk of then providing contaminated water to homes, or if for a domestic well to be then impacted by nitrates. I think we have to be careful that we sort of balance how we're using these tools. And again, I'm going to sound like a real broken record, but I do really believe that with some of these things, we can be proactive. And instead of waiting until we have a flood year, really starting to think about how certain policies need to shift, or we even need to rethink how we manage our surface and groundwater. Because I think a part of ultimately one of even the problems of defining what is a flood flow is that we treat these two systems as disconjointed when they are not. The way that we have set up our water rights doesn't treat surface and groundwater as one whole system, which it is. We have done, unfortunately, the opposite. And one of the root problems of even being able to define a flood flow or flows is the fact that we don't treat a system as holistic. We act as if somehow we can separate the two. And I think that has been a pretty big flaw in how we've done water management for a really long time in California.
Those are really great points, and some of them I hope we'll come back to, because I think there's a lot to be said about how to do different types of recharge and to see them as different and to manage them different and be mindful of the benefits, but also the risks. But to answer your focus on your question, like, how can FloodMar and related efforts improve flood protection? So just taking flood protection as an issue, and I risk going into this because I'm not a flood protection expert, and we have Ron Stork in the room, so Ron will correct me quickly if I get anything wrong. But I think, when you're asking the question, can diversion of water that is in imminent danger of flooding, exceeding the channel capacity of whether it's a flood bypass or a river or stream, whatever it is. So you have that imminent danger coming. And, the peak of a flood event can be sometimes the overtopping or the exceeding may only last like 12 hours or could be a very short, depends on the magnitude of the flood event that's coming. So how much can a diversion of water off at that peak reduce the peak? So I'm just purely like, is it providing a flood protection benefit? I think that there's, the answer will be, it depends on the location. How big is the infrastructure that can take off water? And this is a question that has gotten wrestled with many, other, floodplain restoration efforts. You're like, okay, we're going to set aside 5,000 acres. How would you manage inundation of that 5,000 acres for flood protection? Well, you'd want to take off just the peak, and so how do you time that? How do you manage for it? I'm just merely trying to highlight that it definitely, when you're pulling water off of a system that's on the verge of exceeding its capacity, you're having some kind of benefit. How much of a flood protection or flood control benefit will really vary, and especially on big Central Valley rivers, to have a really measurable reduction in flood height takes a lot of water coming off, and you just, are there pumps that can do that? Are there takeouts that can pull that much off? This gets really complicated and complex, and so undeniably it can have a benefit, but is it the most cost-effective way to do flood protection? I would probably say that it's a tool in the toolbox, but there's a whole, a bigger toolbox of other things that you would do that might be more cost effective or be more protective against even bigger flood events that we're looking at, in addition to doing FloodMar stuff.
I'll just add, because we went through it in 2023, and we think it works. So in 2023, our Kauai subbasin witnessed the highest peak flows and danger. I think the 52 flood, because there was no dam, was much bigger. But when we fired up our program, right, like I said, 12 growers used to take water. So when we fired up, within 24 hours, we had 108 orders into our turnout. And then by the time we were done, we were running about 130, 140 gates on through our system. So history would be you're running about 12 gates and TID doing its operation. In 2023, we were running 140 gates and TID was doing its operation. My board vice president and our board members were coming in on a regular basis, checking how are things going. At one point, my board president came in and he said, "Things must be going good because I want to go play golf today." Right? In the middle of a storm, we didn't overtop one bank. We had no flood. It looked like literally a bubble. Everything else around us flooded. If you took a bus ride around, you saw things that houses, barns, cars flooded everywhere. But in Tulare ID, it was dry. It looked dry, but it was out in the fields. So if you can fire up, it's like having, instead of, like in LA, the LA fires, instead of having one unit fight a fire, you bring in 3 to 4 units, you can get ahead of that fire real quick. In flood, the more people you have backing you up, the faster you can get it out there. Monty's right, though. In certain areas, you just don't take water. It has to be coordinated. If you just tell somebody take water, they're going to flood their neighbor, and then you've got litigation on top of all this other stuff, because we kind of had some of that going on our periphery. Folks that were taking water, and then all of a sudden, wait, it's not on his field anymore, it's on the neighbor's field, and it ruined a house or something like that. So we're going to have to coordinate that better in the future.
I mean, I'll just say one other thing in this, and again, there's probably people in this room who might go into flood safety coordination more, but like, you know, especially in these big river systems that we have, water moves downstream, obviously, and so the coordination of flood management in a real emergency is something that I would say, and maybe it's just obvious, should be coordinated, you know, because if you don't know what people are doing at different places, your estimations of flows and when the peak will arrive and how you'll manage for that, it's the kind of thing that if you get it wrong, people's houses get flooded, people could die, and that's a, you know, that's a challenging thing. Even aside from FloodMar, I mean, the flood management has been an issue in California for a long time. I was on Gray Davis's floodplain management task force after '97, where we were like, what should we do different so that we don't have this same catastrophic, you know, or potentially catastrophic event? And it's, you know, a lot of it is about, you have to treat this whole system as a big system. What happens up in Friant and you know, what you do up there affects whether Stockton or Sacramento is at risk. And so I think in order for us to make sure we don't blow the public safety side of this, I think what is termed flood flows should be coordinated by an agency that has, frankly, the authority and the responsibility, because if you get it wrong, I think the liability issues could be really severe, as well as public safety.
Yeah. That's what, yeah.
Well, it's a morass of things because you combine federal and state. So like our reservoirs are operated by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, and then DWR has a role in there. And so they're all making calls on flood releases independent sometimes of each other. This 2023 was a fantastic year of coordination, though. They were on it. We had good estimates. Everything came in like they anticipated, but in prior years I've seen some crazy things where they're not coordinated. And then reservoir operations are not what people think, right? It's counterintuitive. The value of a reservoir is not the water. The value of a reservoir is the empty space. And so you're managing empty space. And so it gets very complicated because folks want to build supply, but flood protection wants an empty reservoir. So there's competing very, very delicate negotiations that go on, because if you wait one day, and that in 2023, we gauged it by 4 hours. We got it spot on by 4 hours, and we went over the top for about 4 or 5 hours, and then got it back down. But that's how, a lot of times you may miss it by a day, and you're going over the top uncontrolled for a day, and that's when you go over the top of a reservoir, as we found in Oroville and other places, that's where you lose control, and that's bad. As long as you can control it out your outlets, or somewhat your spillways, you're okay. Sorry.
You have a comment, Ash? Looks like you have something to say, so go for it. Yeah.
I do. It's a great question. It's actually very timely. Policymakers right now are asking that same question. Who is the ultimate authority, actually, for declaring a flood? Who has to coordinate with each other? And then who has liability? All of these questions are coming up now because once that emergency order that Aaron referenced was put into law through, as Natalie said, SB 122, it opened up a can of worms for all the issues that we've all alluded to, frankly, of bigger water policy management concerns, which is why I'm frankly here. So a year ago, exactly, I was at this conference listening to the flood panel. Aaron was one of the panelists, and I asked a question in the audience to the representative for Department of Water Resources at that time as to whether there was considerations for the environment and specifically groundwater dependent ecosystems before SB 122 was codified. I already knew the answer. No, simply. And what I didn't understand at that point was that some of those conversations were happening then with how we would not necessarily fix SB 122, but how we would improve the program for diverting flood flows for groundwater recharge without a water right. And the bill that I was then told about shortly after the flood panel finished, that was just shortly to be introduced in a couple weeks was SB 1390 by Senator Caballero. And those conversations are still ongoing today. It's now going to potentially be reintroduced this legislative session, so stay tuned. But those conversations, frankly, should be ongoing because they're important. There's a possibility for conflicting flood declarations, and I'm going to skip ahead and maybe go a little bit into the next question, Pablo, if you'll allow me, is the environmental concern that some of that water would be used for groundwater recharge, and there wouldn't be any sort of overarching authority to tell them when to stop diverting. And so then there would be unintentional or intentional harm to both environmental and ecological needs as well as downstream water rights holders potentially. And so we are actually looking at, how do we prevent that, put those guardrails into policy while still not remaking some of the public health and safety concerns. We have an incredibly extensive coordination system that proved with Aaron and other incredible great water managers on the ground in 2023 that relies on relationships, people who really understand how this complicated water system works. But at the same time, then they need to bring in people like me that look at the ecological needs for fisheries, birds, and other wildlife that need adequate fresh water and that work really on our over-allocated surface water system. Where does that come in to how we manage flood flows, how we define how much we can divert at any one time without jeopardizing health and human safety? And really it comes back to why I do this job. I'm protecting fish for people. I'm protecting birds for people. And so this is a lovely way for us to try to maybe look at the intersection of all these important issues, and something that Natalie and others have said is looking at this holistically. And while it may be through a pretty small lens for flood purposes, it really is more for flow purposes and how we move water and how we manage that in the state.
I'm going to add on to that in a way you probably never imagined an irrigation district would add on to that. Our groundwater system has to support the environment and what we're finding is, Sigma is going to reduce the amount of groundwater pumped. That will reduce the amount of water we apply to the surface, which our environment relies upon. So we're, in the wet periods, we see the egrets, the hawks, everything flourishes. And during drought, we see those things disappear. And so we're very conscientious about, we know we want to reduce our groundwater, but do you really want to reduce your groundwater pumping? Because when we bring it back up to the surface, the environment uses it too. We use it for ag, but we see the egrets come out, because we do flood irrigation, right? So those egrets, and I don't know what they eat, but they eat something in there because they're, and right now in the Tulare Lake area in our region, the population of the egrets is tremendous, and the hawks are coming back too, one by one. So
Any greater sandhill cranes by any chance?
I don't know.
Curious. Okay. No problem.
Tall, white, big beak. Okay. Okay.
I might also just add to,
Go ahead, Monty.
just part of the complexity too, I think, for understanding, in our flood control system, if there, logically the flood control system, like a river system, would get bigger as you go downstream, so that your flood control capacity would be 6,000 CFS, and then as you go down, it goes from 6,000 to 8,000 to 10,000, because catchment area increases, water volume increases, some basic stuff. But our flood control system isn't built like that. There's the system, part of the system that I'm pretty familiar with is on the San Joaquin below Friant, and when if you take a look at that, there are stretches of the river where the actual, flood operation rules say that over 4,500 CFS in the San Joaquin River exceeds the system. And historically, the average annual peak flow would be about like 12 or 14,000 CFS historically. We're not going back to historic conditions or anything, but it's just highlighting that, that this flood control, this channel that's in the river that is also, has a flood operation rule, is undersized for what nature previously had it designed for. And there's other complexities to it that I won't go into, but it's suffice to say that when somebody says, oh, is it a flood event? How much water are you talking about? You're like, well, 4,500 CFS. Well, that's nothing 100 miles down, not even 100 miles, like 60 miles downstream, the flood channel capacity is like 16,000 CFS. So it's very relative to where you are. This is just adding to the shade of complexity of when you describe something as a flood flow. It may not even be really like that rainy out, but it overwhelms locally a system. But maybe downstream, that water is actually needed to maybe even meet water quality objectives and other things downstream, where it is causing a flood issue for that local area, and so two things can be true. My wife likes to tell me that all the time. So, two things or three things could be true, where in one place that water is a flood risk hazard problem, but that same volume of water is actually needed or even expected downstream to meet other water supply objectives. And just adding to that tension maybe is, Aaron, you're kind of alluding to, it's like, there's a tension between flood control and water supply. And that we'll never escape that here. That will always be hand in hand.
Oh, go ahead. I thought Dave had something to add, but no. Okay. Go ahead, Aaron. Yeah.
No, I didn't have anything to say. I accidentally put my hand by the mic.
Oh, okay. I would jump ahead. I guess so it's complicated. Should we be doing more? Like, should we try? So maybe we could talk about SB 122, and I think a bunch of us alluded to that. It was the governor's executive order that basically allowed you to divert flood flows without a permit or any permits, right? That's what that did, and it was to sort of unlock potential water supply benefits, hopefully get some flood control. And then that became law through SB 120 or 122, as Ashley talked about. So I think that maybe focusing on, is that, may I ask all of you, is that a good thing? Like, should we just, that will sunset in, I think, 2029. Should we sunset it sooner? Should we keep it? Should we perfect it? I don't know. So I don't know, maybe round robin, I'll ask Dave to start.
So I'm going to break it into two questions. Okay. One is, should we be doing more managed aquifer recharge? And then the second is that particular permitting model or lack of permitting model what we should do? So my answer to the first question is I think we definitely should, and I don't think we have to do it perfectly. I mean, I think we can imagine, a highly unified, coordinated process where we get just the right amount of water in just the right places. But when you're starting with a system that is far from perfect, you can improve it without being perfect. So I think more and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is a good general principle. I also think we should be careful about over-relying on it. So in a very specific context, if your GSA's GSP, Groundwater Sustainability Plan, is assuming glorious achievements from managed aquifer recharge, and therefore you're not going to do a whole lot of limiting of pumping, that's not going to be good. And so I think we should both be more invested in this and also cautious about what it can achieve. As to the SB 122 model, I like permitting. I think permitting is permitting, if it is done well, is a great process because it allows you to consider a range of trade-offs. It allows you to negotiate good deals, and it can often be done in ways that are highly streamlined and cookie cutter for familiar types of projects or projects that meet certain performance standards in advance in their design. And so I would hope that going forward, we can have a system, perhaps for very extreme floods where it's just a dangerous situation. Sure, just get the water, spread it out, do what you can. But short of that, I think a more robust permitting regime, but also one that gives water managers some certainty that if you do A, B, C, and D, you can get your permit fast, and it's going to be simple and straightforward, is something we should be working towards.
I always bifurcating things into fully appropriated streams and non-fully appropriated streams. So in fully appropriated streams, I don't think it's applicable. And I think it should spell that out very clearly. And I think it should spell out that if you're in a fully appropriated streams or you're going to take flood flows off a fully appropriated stream, you have to work it out with usually a fully appropriated stream will have a water master, an administrator of some sort, and you got to work it out locally. In the non-fully appropriated streams, I do believe a permit to go in and should be sought. I think the critical, and one of the things we are looking at in 1390 and other things is that defining of the, I feel too, flood flows is too big of a title. It should be damaging flows or something. And the way it was defined was the county defines that. Counties don't even have water people. How are they going to make a flood declaration? They're like, don't make yeah, and then they're going to go, wait, I say it's a damaging flow, and then if it damages, now I'm on the stand. And so we think that there needs to be a careful delineation line, like at what stage, and you hit that stage, you're, in that system, you hit that flow stage and you're good to go. You can take it, you have your permit, you can apply the water. It does need to take into account what is the stream. If there are ecological benefits, you can't take it because it's in there for a reason, or those have to be met first before that's in that damaging flows, because you're going to see it as a damaging flow, you're not, right? So you're going to have to take those. The permit would cover you on that.
Thoughts on this, Ashley? And I won't hold it against you if you don't want me.
I always have thoughts. It's just whether or not I should express them.
I have that.
Thanks, Pablo. I think my panelists have brought up really excellent points. I do think that generally speaking, yes, of course, we should do more groundwater recharge where we can, with my echoed, again, caveat of where, how, and how much. And I think that those are important questions we need to answer. I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. I do think that the reason why we are having these conversations, that I'm at the table, and I'm really grateful to be at the table, is because there is opportunity for us to really look at those questions and answer them, I think, in policy. And it's absolutely necessary that we do. I think that we also have to be realistic about what we can achieve before 2029. Acknowledge the extensive policy analysis that's already been done that shows that there are major gaps and that people have abused this program already. And so acknowledging that we need to put additional guardrails in place and making sure those aren't burdensome, so streamlining and making clear the permitting could be easily done, but also giving regulatory certainty for people on the ground. And I do think that it's quite possible we were very close last year to reaching improvements on SB 122. I think what was really helpful was the technical analysis released by the State Water Board on the water code section that came out in the fall, which I'm hoping will inform these future conversations, because it showed that, I'm going to throw the elephant in the room, that there may be harm to the Delta. Yep, I know, I went there. But one of the many aspects of my job is to really look at the health of the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary, the largest freshwater estuary west of the Mississippi, and frankly relies on what some would classify as flood flows. And yes, two things can absolutely be true at the same time. Upstream communities could be at risk of flooding and injuring people's homes and livelihoods, while then not enough water actually even reaches the Bay Delta to help, for example, white sturgeon that need 30,000 CFS to successfully reproduce. Their lifespans are 90 years old. These are dinosaur fish, and they have declined by 80% since the late 1980s. Compared to some of the other more fish that you hear more often in the media that have a 1-year lifespan or a 3-year lifespan, such as Chinook salmon, white sturgeon in their decline, one of the main reasons is because they are not getting adequate fresh water in the Delta. So acknowledging that and making sure that that's at least, protected, as well as, of course, all the other in-stream flow needs for tributaries that lead to the Delta, and then, of course, incredibly important ecosystem benefits that rely on a certain amount of flooding. Downstream of the Delta is all something that Defenders wants to make sure is included in future policy.
Natalie, do you want to offer some thoughts on 122? Good, bad, indifferent?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when the emergency order was put in, or sorry, executive order was put in place, when we first saw it, and then when we started to actually look at what got reported onto the State Water Board website, to to Ashley's point, yeah, we already noticed that there were, we saw that some of recharge did happen on dairyland. That was one of our biggest concerns when we saw that executive order, precisely because of how bad our nitrate issue already is. And when, we heard that it was going to be codified under SB 122, a lot of our engagement with the legislature was to try to put some of those protections in place. So we didn't have this this unintended consequence to wanting to do more recharge. Um, and of course, generally, yes, like more recharge will be helpful, right? But I think ultimately recharge is just one tool to help us find balance in our water portfolio. And I think we can't run the risk of over depending on it. One of the things that actually Aaron had mentioned during his presentation at the Sigma anniversary event that DWR had, they made a conscious choice that recharge could not be their plan A. And I think that is something that we really need to keep in mind. Again, it will be helpful, but it's not going to be the only way we achieve sustainability. And honestly, for some of the communities that we work with, recharge could be helpful, but for some, recharge won't actually regain them back access to water. For some, that ship has sailed. Really for them, the long-term option is going to be getting connected to a nearby water system that will be able to provide them water in the long term. So I caution the overuse of recharge. No matter how we're defining certain things, it's just we can't act like we can, we'll have even access to that water. We swing from extremely wet to extremely dry pretty quickly here in California, and our drier periods are getting longer and longer. So sure, there's definitely fixes that are needed to SB 122, but I also think while we can fix that, we should probably also concentrate on other things we need to do to help our aquifers recover.
Well said, yeah. And Monty, yeah.
I'll maybe say this, is that when you talk about floodmar, if you're talking about managing flood waters and generating reduction in flood risk and increasing public safety while also recharging our aquifers, it's kind of a win-win. And it needs to be coordinated, done right, so that it really doesn't impact, it improves public safety, not endanger it. Is floodmar the best way to improve flood recharge? I'd actually say it's one tool in the toolbox, but for many years, again, out of the floodplain management task force, and others, it's really the biggest problem is our rivers are constrained and we don't have enough floodplain storage areas. Joe Countryman, as some people will remember from MBK, told me the story that in the San Joaquin, if anybody knows that system, that the Chowchilla bypass was only supposed to have a levee on one side, on the eastern side. And the idea was that when floods would happen, that the river would come out of its banks and it would flood between the river and the east side of the Chowchilla bypass, thereby intentionally meaning to flood inundate this area. But then, that intention got lost and a west side of it was constructed, and, the main channel has 4,500 CFS capacity and the Chowchilla bypass has 5,000, and then combined it's 9, and it's still below, the mean average. All this is to say that I think our rivers, especially in the Central Valley, particularly the San Joaquin, it used to spread way out. And that was how it managed high flows, and we had tons of recharge and habitat and other things. And pulling water off and doing recharge in a managed way is definitely part of the tools. But if we really want to meaningfully improve flood protection, dealing with the intensities we expect from climate change, with the existing risk that exists today with Stockton and Sacramento, we're going to have to think bigger than FloodMar to achieve that. If we talk about recharge, then, I think the answer is absolutely, again, is yes. We have a massive deficit in our groundwater basins, not just in the Central Valley, which we keep talking about. Recharge is super important for coastal rivers and streams, where once rain is stopped, all the water that you see in all your coastal streams that you love to go and visit that are little tiny trickles, all that's groundwater. And if we don't maintain groundwater recharge in those places, we also won't get recovery of coho and steelhead and other things. So recharge is super important, and it's the biggest groundwater banking thing that we could do, to make a pun intended. But it's, so I think recharge, writ large is a really important thing. And the more that we can find ways to do it that are multi-benefit, so that we're generating water supply, I would say benefits, and I'll say in a second, but also you commensurate with public safety and habitat. That's how you pay for these expensive projects. Single purpose flood protection, water supply projects don't fly as much, so I think the way we tie them together makes them more feasible. I will say that I think it's really important to realize that recharge right now concerns me in the way that it might generate suddenly an increase in demand. Like somebody's like, I'm recharging, I can put in more agriculture when we already have a big deficit to address. And so I would hope that when we think about what we do with recharges, we use it as an opportunity to restore our groundwater basins and get back to a bigger, amount of water that's stored, because we may need it in some really, really bad extended drought that is surely going to happen someday. And so I think making sure that it doesn't induce more agricultural demand would be kind of a thing to be concerned about.
Great. Excellent points. I think we have a minute left. All right, I wanted to see if there, do we have more time? I think we go to 5. We go to 5? Oh, wow, okay. I better come up with some more questions. Well, let me see if there's questions in the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Trying to recharge and overdraft like paying back for something that occurred over the last as if who are we recharging for, and why do we need to recharge so that we undo the damage done? That's just time. And now there is this conversation that incentives mechanism it makes sense. Knowing that they can pump that 50% of the water further down. I think Pájaro was talking about that notion that this is really for me to get back. And the other aspect that is just, again, there are regions in the San Joaquin, there's regions where land was sold for agricultural purposes that rely exclusively on groundwater. We are now filled with olive oil, olive groves, almond groves, vineyards in the Donegal, non-irrigated lands. Since the all of a sudden now that aquifer has been depleted. Definitely an overdraft, but nobody knows. Nobody knew how much water there was in this hungry hollow aquifer that has its own structure. And nobody knows how much water is being pumped because growers don't want to put meters on their pumps. Trying to figure out a sustainable, and it's all about demand side and save agriculture, besides that agriculture in California, agriculture has to recognize that it has actually developed the land up into the edge of the river, taking all these land that the river was actually using and it was part of the river. Then the next question becomes, like every question is like, oh, so who's going to indemnify?
Indemnify. That's what I'm here for.
Every agreement has an indemnity.
Who's going to indemnify the Boswell family for giving land back in the Tulare Lake Basin?
Yeah.
Well, it was an interesting question because in my world, I see from your perspective, oh, we built the groundwater credit, so now I can go plant on that. In my world, it's all about, okay, instead of reducing 100 acres, maybe we can, so Sigma kind of is the counterbalance against that water balance scenario. So, but now that water balance only starts in 2015, right? So it's a good question about, well, what if that company came in and now they've established a footprint prior to the 2015 demarcation, so you're saving something that came in 2012, right? So was it supposed to be there or not? And I can't answer those questions, but I can say that agriculture is what I call that. What you're saying is we're going to reduce it. It's called the right sizing, right? So can we live within this bucket of water and still produce and be a vibrant industry within the state of California? That's what we're going through right now, and it's very difficult. And there can be a whole nother panel on what we're currently seeing in the Central Valley, right? And our citizens are living that today, right? So we're seeing devaluation of land, loss of jobs, and then the outcomes of fallow ground, right? So talk about an environmental nightmare. When somebody walks away from a field, you have problems that are not going to be contained. You're managing those from miles away because it's a pest and they go outward. So Sigma, we're feeling the pressures of Sigma on both sides. We're trying to do our best. I'll tell you right now, if anybody puts a new field in, I'm going to be the first one there saying, "Are you crazy?" So that's all I can say on that. But it's an interesting viewpoint. Remember, a lot of agriculture was screaming and yelling because we were seeing things happen internally, right? But those were driven by policies set at many different levels that said it's okay. And not only that, we'll give you a grant to go put that. The federal and the state government literally subsidize thousands and thousands and thousands of acres to come into production in the Central Valley. So you talk about indemnifying somebody, but the banks lined up and so did the state and said, go for it, right?
Yeah, I'll just comment. I remember, I'll never forget January 2014 being at the Rangeland Conservation Coalition meeting in Oakdale. And we had a guy from UCD Extension talk to this room full of ranchers talking about how he helped people put in almond orchards. And everyone in the room was like, because these ranchers on the east side had watched all these orchards go in on groundwater wells, and they were not happy about it. And so, but this guy thought that was a good thing to do. And anyway, just bolstering your point.
I would also add to that, not to complicate it, but 90% of that went in was not on California dollars. Yeah. And the profit don't end up in California dollars. Right. Yeah. And most of that ground is not owned by farmers. Yeah. Most of this ground that came into production in the last 10 to 15 years was not necessarily, I mean, some of it is, but most of it is corporate. If you institutional investors, think about it, we lose more money than we make money, I think, on the long haul of it all. And if you're an investor and a loss in agriculture is a profit in another sector. So what they were doing is picking up ag ground and taking the loss on it. The value of the ground was going through the roof. So they were making the value on the ground because they bought it at, in our area, some people bought it at about 12 to 15,000. They planted the tree and it was worth 25 the next day. They lost money on the crop for 7 years. It was a crop write-off for 7 years, and it protected an investment that was a stock or a mutual fund or whatever. And if you look at the underlying title of most of that ground, it's a retirement. One of them was the Teachers Union of Iowa or something like that. We're like, what? Like, when they come in, they register their turnout with us, we get all this data, and we're like, this is crazy. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is there is an SB 122 every 2 years. The speakers are referring to SB 122 of the 2023-2024 legislative session. That was a budget trailer bill which has dozens of sections, most of which have nothing to do with water. So I'll refer to it as Water Code Section 1241.1, which is the specific thing the speaker is referring to. The question, kind of sort of, is that one of the quandaries in trying to define when you can divert for flood flows, for groundwater recharge, is there are situations on the San Joaquin tributaries where upstream reaches have flows exceeding channel capacity, but the flows are insufficient to meet Delta water quality standards, requiring the projects to release water to make up for the deficiencies in the flows coming in. So of course, the water contractors are saying you shouldn't be able to divert then, whereas the people in the upstream areas are saying, what are you saying? There's a flood risk here. Now there's a way to handle that through a permit system, because the loss to the projects is less than the water that can be put underground. So the projects through a permit system could be compensated by taking some of that recharge and putting it back in the rivers where it benefits the projects and more than makes up, or at least makes up, for their loss. So my question, more in the way of a rhetorical question, is why not handle this through the temporary permits, which can provide for permits for groundwater recharge and deal with these kind of complications, instead of trying to define when you can divert without a permit?
Anyone want to take that? I have
I've heard that the argument against the permit system is that it is too cumbersome under the state board. I don't agree with that. I know Eric Ekdahl and his team have provided streamlined permitting, but that is the argument I've heard, is that they needed the executive order in this path because the state board path is not realistic. That's what I've heard.
I'll just throw out a complication that's going to come up, not just in this situation, but I think in many situations, is that not all of the water that you put into the ground is going to make it to the aquifer. And some of what makes it to the aquifer will move, and then some of what you put into the ground that does make it to the aquifer might take years to get there. And this was, so a little over a year ago, I went to the American Geophysical Union's conference, and I was just blown away by the amount of research on what goes on between the surface and the water table, and how complicated it is, how much time it can take. And so I think this is just a real challenge, because when we think about permits, we tend to default, especially if you're a lawyer like me, to an assumption that it's kind of like a water tank. Like you pour the water in and then it's right there, and then you can take it back out when you need it. And it is so different from a water tank. And so in the kind of situation where you're talking about, where I think you're contemplating some sort of exchange, well, okay, you're going to have some sort of discount rate for that exchange. And in any other setting where, again, you're assuming the water you put in then offsets some part of your pumping cap, again, well, it's not a simple equation. Or if you choose a simple equation, you better have a significant margin of error. And then also there's the possibility of having some of that water go in be cut to the aquifer, which basically means, 40% of what you actually recharge, not 40%, that would be low. Let's say 80% of what you actually recharge to the aquifer is available for you to take out, and the rest is going to be put towards restoring water levels or trying to get back to in-stream flows. And so you've got a whole set of really complicated questions. But to me, that leads back to exactly the same point where you started, which is why not deal with that through permitting, because permitting does, I mean, that makes it more complicated, but permitting does allow you to think through some of those issues.
You got a comment, Monty? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that a permitting framework is going to be needed, and it won't just be a simple equation. And I think the issues that you're bringing up are, you know, the leave behind. You put water in, you don't get 1-to-1. It's some sort of ratio. That's going to take work to figure out what it is, but it's not impossible to do. It's just going to take, and maybe each water, maybe depending on the geology and so forth, that'll need to be worked out. And could be worked out in advance so that there is streamlined permitting so that you can do this stuff quickly and efficiently. And I think that, you know, again, I think that the harder thing is actually when you're going to talk about not actually flood flows, but you're talking about high flow recharge. And the water board has a 90-20 rule that's I think to your point is it's very protective. You know, it's meant, you know, it's basically, I think it's restrictive to the point where a lot of people who want to do recharge are like that. The frequency with which I can do recharge is so little because you're being so protective and making sure that you're not taking water that's needed for the environment. So this is, I think, one of the bigger challenges is to figure out what flows, high flows are needed to stay in stream to do the ecological work. And you know, this can be a really complicated question that revolves around site-specific studies and other things. There is also, and then there's the water board's methodology that was developed, and a lot of thought went into that, and it's, you know, it is what it is. I think a lot of people want to see something that's a little bit more flexible, but now we're into uncharted territory. The California Environmental Flow Framework is a tool that does exist, that was developed by UC Davis and UC Berkeley, and the Water Board was involved in some of it. The Nature Conservancy and other conservation groups created this modeling tool that basically provides an estimate of how much water needs to stay in stream for high flow events. And it's not just a simple formula. It kind of recognizes that you need to have at least one peak storm event, you know, in order to do certain types of geomorphic processes. Once you've achieved that once, you don't need to have that same peak flow event happen again. It's more complicated, but it's a tool that pretty readily could be used to at least estimate how much water needs to stay in stream for ecological benefit, but then it also helps identify fairly readily maybe what is available above and beyond that. But whether it's that tool or some other tool, I think that needs to get worked out. And that's not easy, but if we don't work it out, we will not figure out what is available that's high flows that could be used for recharge that benefits nature as well as people and water supply. And then permit it so that it can happen when those high flow events happen, because they're unscheduled. We don't know when they're going to happen, and you got to be ready with a permit that allows you to do it.
So you're saying you want senior water right holders to have to report their use on a regular basis? Sorry, Aaron probably wouldn't like that. Natalie, you had a comment.
Yeah, and this is a comment as Natalie, a student of water, not as like Natalie Leadership Council. As I didn't share this at the start of the presentation, but fun fact: I've been studying California water for about 8 years now. I think and I'll go back to a point that I made earlier. I think fundamentally we do have a water rights system problem. I think we've tried to address it with permitting, but until we recognize that our water rights system is flawed, it can't respond to the reality of hydrology and the different needs that that hydrology requires. We're gonna end up continuously in this question of like trying to fix permitting. Is permitting really the issue here, or is the problem that water rights system that I think in a lot of ways is really antiquated?
I'm going to give a quick.
Oh, you got us going, Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, I think antiquated is not the same as changeable. Unfortunately, I think there is some flexibility within California water rights systems, but I think any sort of, I mean, there's been a lot of calls, I think, from very well-meaning reformers for really overhauling California water rights, and the current United States Supreme Court will not let that happen. It's simply not an option. I think you can do things with things like public trust doctrine and reasonable use that give you some flexibility. I think you can make some really positive changes by perhaps bringing pre-1914 rights into a more strict regulatory system where they're not just sort of whatever the user says they are. I'm not saying anything about how you treat them. Anyway,
So wait till you get to my comment.
I mean, PCL's done a great job, I think, in recent years of identifying incremental improvements to the water rights system that, in a sense, make it more like a functional property rights system and less like the Wild West. But I think if we are going into reform efforts thinking that we are going to transform the historic inequities of the water rights system, that's not going to work. And it is not going to work because we are embedded in a United States legal system that will not let that happen. And I think it does not. I kind of wish it were otherwise, but that's where we are.
I was at the PCL conference last time, and they were talking. It was a water rights panel, and that same thing came up. It was like everybody was like, "Oh, the water rights system in the state of California is managed by old white men," and somebody looked over to me, and they were like, nah, "I'm old, but I'm Asian. I don't know if that counts for anything." And then I've engaged in some issues that are happening at the state level with. That same rhetoric, but they're not in my boardroom with my board of directors. They're old men, yes. Do we want women? Yeah, we were not going to avoid that. The problem is, and it was alluded to, is I think we all want, do I want to tinker with it because it would make some beneficial changes? But I want to warn everybody, if you think you're going to go in and sit and adjust water rights, so will the corporate America. And if you think you're powerful and have good ideas, they're powerful and have greater ideas, if you know what I mean.
Fair enough.
Doesn't matter. I mean, I live in the. They will they will out attorney you and out dollar you.
No, you're pointing at me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Because you're going to be on the other side, and so will I.
Professional ethics of lawyers
Okay, now he has to.
trust into a private slush fund.
He has to answer that question. I pay a lot of attorney fees, so do other people. And every time I go into, you go into a courtroom against something, I'm outmanned, outgunned all the time. And you look at the dollars that are coming into California right now in agriculture. Again, California has made the family farmer obsolete. You cannot survive growing anything in the state of California if you don't have an attorney and an engineer and a team. So who comes in? Investment dollars. We have them, and I'm not arguing it. They are our best farmers because they have a legal team that vets the ground, makes sure there's a water supply. They have a real estate team that makes sure the value in the water matches. They have a farm management team that makes sure that every drop of water gets used efficiently. But they are not going to allow you to touch their water rights. And if you do open up that Pandora box opens up, they're going to make sure they come out on the better side of that. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to water, if
Yeah,
that's okay.
so-
But I'd also like to answer Andy's question, if that's okay, or comment. I agree with you. Defenders had a public stance that as part of that trailer bill package that the Newsom administration pushed through without adequate policy committee analysis, that it was unnecessary. There was current laws on the books, in my opinion, and through temporary permits that adequately addressed the need for diversion of flood flows, potentially for groundwater recharge or other multi-beneficial purposes. The fact that we were copying and pasting words from temporary permits that the Water Board had put in into actual law was concerning last year in 1390. I was literally copying and pasting guardrails that you had put into temporary permits into this bill as suggested amendments in order to make sure that it was consistent, overcomplicating a situation that I feel like was already adequately complex. So I think that in terms of now the damage is done. 1242.1 is in law, and frankly, we have analysis now by both our State Water Resources Control Board and policy committees that show that improvements need to be made, or, you know, at least some guardrails, because I'm certainly, for one, not going to allow SB 122 or 1242.1 in our water code to continue to harm the Delta and potentially communities before 2029. They do not deserve that. The wildlife does not deserve that, nor do the people.
So,
Look, can we just bring this back? I mean, I want to try and avoid the water. I mean, we can have the water rights conversation. Dennis, you have a question on about 1242.1?
I think that one of the things that frustrates me with this conversation, and has for the last however long we've been talking about this stuff, is that it presumes that we have a flood management system that even approaches adequacy. If you had a well-functioning flood management system, you could build in flood MAR where it's appropriate. You could even build in emergency weirs to capture the big flood flows in those cases where it's not going to screw downstream water rights holders or water quality stuff. I think that this is almost a necessary condition to really fixing this when can you divert flood flows and when can't you, is to at least provide minimal flood protection along those parts. You know, if it floods every year, you have a problem whether or not you do flood MAR or not.
Do you have a response?
Yeah, that was kind of my point. But also, I mean, for those of us who've worked on some of this stuff, I mean, the DWR has and the Flood Board have done analyses to show where you could do far more flood recharge work without it being a flood. So then it would be recharge work that would create habitat and recharge on a more frequent basis. And it would just be, mostly it's about setting the levees back, which is very complicated, not easy to do. But if we had a flood management system that actually worked, it would work in terms of public safety, but it would also work in terms of ecologically it would work. And that would be, frankly, it'd be expensive to do, but the water supply, the habitat, and the public safety benefits, I think, far exceed the cost of what it would take to do it. Part of it is it's complicated, but that to me, that's the solution that actually we really need to be driving toward.
I think there's some sign. Did you guys want another comment? Natalie? No. Well, I did want to bring it back to why are we having this conversation, which is sort of like Dennis's point, and Aaron, you alluded to that. I'm in the legislature. My bosses, the policymakers, and their staff, like i.e. me, are hearing from people the permitting system isn't fast enough, and we're not doing enough. Like we're hearing from a lot of voices that, you know, there's a lot of interest in groundwater recharge. There's potential flood benefit, and the permitting system isn't working. So it's interesting. 2023 is a great example because there was a tweet from someone in the San Joaquin Valley about, something like, it'd be nice if we had permits in place to divert all this extra water. That was, and like my boss, who was on the floor of the assembly, texted me like, what's going on with this? Because her colleagues were asking her about it. And so there's this perception, and so we, had to call the water board and we look at it, and there's 6 permits in queue, which doesn't seem like a lot. But there's a perception that the permitting isn't doing this expeditiously or fast enough. I think maybe there's something to that. I'll say what's interesting in 2023, so according to DWR, we recharged 4.1 million acre feet that year, but something like 400,000 acre feet of that were recharged under SB 122. So it's interesting to me because we're focusing on the temporary, but like we didn't need 122. Like we have a program. And so the vast majority, there is a lot of recharge happening, whether intended or not. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm eliciting a response. Like here's why we're having this conversation, I think, because there's a very live policy discussion. Maybe the question is, do we need 122 at all in the first place? Like maybe it's just sort of this political perception that's erroneous. That wouldn't be the first time that's happened. So Ashley, you teed that one up for you.
I think it's definitely a fundamental misunderstanding of our water management system, and unfortunately, a false dichotomy of different sectors of the water policy. I'm a victim of that. I was only taught surface water rights, for example, in law school. I didn't even know there were groundwater rights until I got into the field.
The school's improved a bit.
Well, yes, considering that you're a professor there now. Yes, absolutely. And, you know, I think that looking at the system holistically while also acknowledging that there's room for improvement in our flood management system, but also in how we manage the system altogether. I'm not going to touch the water rights thing. I want us to look at it at a higher level and more holistically. There's just great room for improvement. It'd be nice if we actually, you know, enforce the rules on the books, like did something with the public trust doctrine. Man, would I be a fan of that. You know, I think that it would be nice if we actually made the connection between the idea of reaching sustainability in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and GSPs with forecast-informed reservoir operations and how many gauges we have on the ground and whether we actually have defined flood stage at every single tributary and leading into the delta, which we don't. Those all need to be crosswalked, frankly. Those are all major fundamental issues that will help with the flood management system, but overall the entire management of our water system, groundwater and surface water and otherwise.
You know, 2023 was just an odd one too, so it's hard to use that as the litmus test because you remember, I was going around giving talks in October, November, and early December, right, at Aqua, saying about, well, Aaron, okay, you've got all these programs. All the media is saying it's a El Nino year, 50% greater chance it's going to be dry. Are your programs going to withstand another drought year? And then 15 days later, I'm in all-out flood release. So it wasn't that I think people were saying the system was too slow. They didn't realize it till 15 days too late, right? So if people learned anything, what they're going to do is even on a year like this, they should have had their permits in October, November, December. But I don't know. I don't track the state board permit applications. But and in like what's happened in our irrigation district, everybody knows now. You finish your year off, take your harvest off, and then get your field ready for flood operations. And so they're ready to go. I think over time people will get to that stage and be ready for it. But then again, do they have to use a permit? Do they have to use a 120 or 14 whatever? Yeah. 1242. What are they going to use? And I think the best thing we can do for folks is provide them with an example of how to do it. Because if you provide them with a clear path, then they'll just use that path. If you provide them with nothing, then everybody's going to make it up on their own or try and tread their own way through.
So we need to clone you and your district?
Remember, I don't use the...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just say, I think there are going to be situations going forward in 2023-like years where we may have waterways that we thought were fully appropriated, and there's a dangerous level of flow in that waterway, and we want to consider the possibility of extra diversions. I think there are going to be situations in which we need a new permitting regime, even if the bulk of the recharge is happening under existing rights and in accordance with those rights. And so it may be an addition that operates at the margins in many situations, but those margins might, even if it's just, making a 2% difference in our overall water supply, which might be wildly optimistic, the margins aren't going to matter, at least to some people in some places, and I think it's worthwhile to be prepared for it. So I do think there is that need, even if it might not be how most of the recharge takes place. I guess one other thing I should just say, this is just a clarifying point for those of you who, like me, are not scientists. Most of the recharge that happens in California is just natural recharge. So it's worth remembering that we don't have to actively recharge everything that gets into these aquifers. Most of what's getting into them is through these natural processes, and what we're doing is talking about augmentation at the margins.
Yeah.
I would just maybe, I think we've actually lost a lot of recharge because we no longer inundate the landscape. So so there's a deficit there, how we can just be prepared for the next flood event. Whether I love that your point. It's like take your crop off and get ready for winter. You know, the way you can prepare for any, you know, whether there's going to be a recharge possibility this year or any year is to build your flood control system with a point in the levee system where when you overtop that elevation, it floods your recharge basin, and then it happens passively. You don't have to get a permit. The permit maybe is in the design of the recharge basin, but you know, you could basically have a system where, you know, if 8,000 is your CFS, is your capacity, you have a weir that at 8,000 it overtops that weir safely into a recharge basin that is intended to, that's good for recharge, that is intended to be used for that purpose, and then it just happens like it did in nature.
We're also, to add on to that too, the best way to slow up a flood control system is to slow it coming down the system, right? Because the system's narrow down instead of widen out, you have the biggest system up top. So we've got some creative projects in the CWIA where we're slowing it down. We slow the flood flow. So what we're doing is taking old mining operations, which are, they've come into these river streams and basically created holes all over the place, and walk away from them. And we're going to turn them into habitat restoration and flood flow capture so that we can exactly carve a notch. You hit the notch and off into the reservoir it goes, and it's got we do have the cranes there and all the hawks there. And then you have that natural slowing down of the system and keep it upstream, and then that percolation comes down to you over time.
Right. We've gone over time now, so I think, okay.
Watershed management, really, from the ridge down.
John Wesley Powell, yeah. All right, thank you to the panel. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us. That's great.